Imagine being told your country has just been deleted. Not invaded, not bombed, not conquered, just removed. Expelled from the nation it belonged to, like a problem that had become too complicated to solve. No warning, no plan, no safety net. One morning you are part of something larger. By afternoon, you are completely alone. That is exactly what happened on August 9th, 1965. And the man who had to face it stood in front of the cameras, tried to speak, and broke down in tears. His name was Lee Kuan Yew. He was the prime minister of a brand new country that nobody asked for and nobody believed in. The country was called Singapore. It was 278 square miles of tropical island at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula, smaller than New York City. It had no oil, no gas, no coal, no farmland worth speaking of, no minerals. The island didn't even produce enough fresh water to keep its own people alive. Every drop of drinking water came from Malaysia, the same country that had just kicked it out. Unemployment was running at nearly 14%. Communist insurgents were actively trying to destabilize the government. The British military bases that employed tens of thousands of Singaporeans were being shut down and withdrawn, and the population of just under 2 million people was fractured. Chinese, Malay, Indian, each with their own language, their own religion, their own loyalties, and their own reasons to distrust everyone else. World leaders, economists, and foreign diplomats looked at this island and gave it one assessment: it would not survive. They were spectacularly wrong. Today, Singapore's GDP per capita is higher than the United States of America. A country that was given no chance, no resources, no allies, no strategic depth, no history of self-governance, now has a higher average income than the most powerful economy on the planet. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita was approximately $500 per year, the same as Mexico, the same as South Africa. Today it stands above $94,000. The United States sits at $89,000. This did not happen by accident. It did not happen because of luck or oil or geography alone. It happened because of a series of decisions made by one man and the government he built. Decisions that were cold, deliberate, and in many cases deeply controversial. Some of those decisions were admired around the world. Others were condemned. All of them worked. This is the full story of how Singapore pulled off the greatest economic transformation in modern history. Lee Kuan Yew was born in 1923 in Singapore, the great-grandson of Chinese immigrants. He was brilliant from the start, a scholarship student who went to Cambridge University in England and graduated at the top of his class in law. He came back to Singapore not to get rich, but to fight. He fought against British colonial rule in the 1950s. He fought against the communists who were trying to take over the labor unions. And in 1959, when Singapore gained limited self-governance, he became its first prime minister at age 35. He was not warm. He was not beloved in the way that charismatic leaders are beloved. He was feared and respected, which, as he would argue for the rest of his life, was more useful. When Singapore was forcibly separated from Malaysia in 1965, Lee did not pretend it was an opportunity. He understood it as a catastrophe that had to be managed with surgical precision, or it would become a disaster that could not be recovered from. There was no room for ideology, no room for sentiment, no room for the kind of nationalist chest-beating that was consuming every other newly independent country in the developing world at that time. Lee looked at Singapore and asked one question: what do we actually have? The answer was almost nothing. A deep-water port, a location at the crossroads of global shipping routes between East Asia and Europe, a population that was, for the most part, literate and hard-working. And one other thing, a government that was willing to make decisions that would be unpopular in the short term if they were necessary in the long term. That was it. That was everything Singapore had to work with. The first problem was jobs. With unemployment above 14% and the British military pulling out, Singapore needed to create tens of thousands of positions in an economy that had almost no industrial base. The conventional solution in 1965 The solution that newly independent nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America were all choosing was to nationalize industries, close borders to foreign capital, and build a protected domestic economy behind high tariff walls. Lee did the opposite. He threw Singapore open. He understood something that most post-colonial leaders refused to accept, that foreign companies were not the enemy. Foreign capital, foreign expertise, and foreign markets were the only way a tiny island with no resources could build an industrial economy fast enough to survive. He created the Economic Development Board, a government agency with one job: make Singapore the most attractive place on earth for multinational corporations to set up factories. The result was Jurong. In the early 1960s, Jurong was a swamp on the western edge of the island. Villages, plantations, patches of jungle, and tens of thousands of mosquitoes. The finance minister, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, proposed turning 9,000 acres of this swampland into Singapore's first industrial estate. Critics called it Goh's Folly. They said it was too big, too expensive, too risky for a country that barely existed. The government built it anyway. By 1967, just 2 years after independence, the Jurong Industrial Estate had attracted investments worth $178 million in fixed assets and created jobs for 6,500 workers. Shell came. Hewlett-Packard came. Texas Instruments came. Within a decade, the unemployment crisis had reversed completely. Singapore was facing a labor shortage. The country that had no jobs was now importing workers. But Lee was already thinking about the next problem. Jobs in factories were good for 1965. They would not be enough for 1980. The second decision was the one that nobody else in Southeast Asia was willing to make. Language. Singapore had 4 official languages: English, Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil. In a country of barely 2 million people, divided by ethnicity and history, the question of which language to use in schools and government was not just practical. It was a minefield. Every community wanted their language to be primary. Every community had legitimate historical reasons for that demand. Lee chose English, not because he wanted to erase Chinese culture or Malay heritage. He chose English for the same reason he made every decision: cold, strategic logic. English was the language of global commerce, of multinational corporations, of international law, of finance, and of technology. A Singaporean child educated in English could be hired by any company in the world. A Singaporean child educated only in Mandarin or Tamil could not. In a country with no natural resources, where human capital was the only asset, making every citizen employable on a global level was not a cultural policy. It was a survival strategy. The backlash was fierce. Chinese-speaking communities felt betrayed. There were protests. There was anger. Lee did not reverse course. Within a generation, Singapore's bilingual education system, English as the working language, mother tongue as the second, became one of the most copied education models on the planet. The third decision was the one that foreign investors cared about more than anything else: corruption. In 1965, corruption was not just common in Singapore, it was embedded in the system. Police officers expected payments, government officials expected payments, businessmen paid to get permits, to get contracts, to get anything done. This was normal. It was how things worked across most of Southeast Asia and across most of the developing world. Lee declared war on it. Not symbolically, not with speeches, structurally. He raised the salaries of government officials to competitive private sector levels, removing the economic incentive to take bribes. He gave the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau independent powers to investigate anyone, including cabinet ministers. He prosecuted his own allies when they were found guilty. One of his closest friends and a founding member of his political party was found guilty of corruption and was convicted. Lee let it happen. The message was received. Within years, Singapore had built a reputation as one of the cleanest governments in Asia. Foreign companies that were nervous about doing business in Southeast Asia, nervous about losing contracts to whoever paid the biggest bribe, found in Singapore something they couldn't find anywhere else in the region, a place where the rules actually applied to everyone. Money follows trust, and trust, once established, compounds faster than interest. By the mid-1970s, Singapore had done what almost no one thought possible. It had gone from 14% unemployment to full employment. It had built an industrial base from scratch. It had attracted billions of dollars in foreign investment to an island that 10 years earlier had nothing. And Lee Kuan Yew was already worried it wasn't enough. He saw the ceiling approaching. Low-wage manufacturing was the entry point, not the destination. Japan had already moved up the value chain. South Korea was starting to. Singapore, with its tiny land area and rapidly rising wages, could not compete on labor costs with larger countries for much longer. If Singapore stayed in textiles and basic manufacturing, it would be crushed by Indonesia, Malaysia, and China as their own labor forces developed. So Lee did something that most governments are simply too short-sighted to do. While the economy was still growing, while unemployment was low and the population was relatively content, he began deliberately dismantling the industries that had saved Singapore and replacing them with something harder, more complex, and more valuable. Out of basic manufacturing, into precision engineering, into electronics, into petrochemicals, into pharmaceuticals. Companies like Philips, Siemens, and later Glaxo and Merck were recruited to set up not just factories, but research operations in Singapore. The government invested massively in technical education, training an entire generation of engineers and scientists rather than just assembly line workers. And then there was the port. Singapore's port had always been important. Its location on the Strait of Malacca meant that ships traveling between Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia had to pass near it. But in the 1970s and 1980s, the government invested in making it not just convenient, but indispensable. New container terminals, world-class logistics infrastructure, competitive port fees. The Port of Singapore became the busiest port on Earth, a position it has held for decades. Changi Airport opened in 1981, replacing the outdated Paya Lebar facility. It was not built to be adequate. It was built to be the best airport in the world. And it was. Airlines that could use any hub in Asia chose Changi. Business travelers who could fly through Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, or Hong Kong chose Singapore. Every flight that landed at Changi brought passengers who ate in Singapore's restaurants, stayed in Singapore's hotels, and conducted business in Singapore's offices. By the 1980s, Singapore was generating surplus capital. The question was what to do with it. Most governments spend their surpluses on infrastructure, on subsidies, on welfare programs that win elections, on military spending. Singapore did something different. In 1981, the Government Investment Corporation, known as GIC, was created with a single mandate: invest Singapore's reserves in global markets for the long term. Not for the next election cycle, not for the next 5 years, for the next 50 years. Lee's instructions to GIC were explicit. The money was not to be touched for political purposes. It was not a slush fund. It was not a development bank. It was a sovereign wealth fund managed with the discipline of the world's best institutional investors. Temasek Holdings, which had been created in 1974 to manage the government's ownership stakes in Singapore companies, evolved into a second sovereign wealth fund, investing not just in Singapore, but in companies and assets across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Today, GIC manages over $700 billion in assets. Temasek manages over $300 billion. Combined, the two funds represent over $1 trillion in capital, managed on behalf of a country with a population of just 6 million people. For context, that is more sovereign wealth per citizen than Saudi Arabia's oil fund manages for Saudi citizens. A country with no oil, no minerals, and no resources had quietly built one of the largest investment portfolios in human history. But there is one more piece of this story. The piece that Lee Kuan Yew himself considered the most important of all: housing. In 1960, when the Housing Development Board was created, more than a third of Singapore's population lived in overcrowded slums, squatter settlements, atap huts, no clean water, no sanitation. The kind of urban poverty that produces instability, crime, and political radicalization. Lee didn't just build public housing. He built public housing that people owned. The Central Provident Fund, Singapore's mandatory savings scheme, was structured so that Singaporeans could use their own savings contributions to buy their HDB flats. The government built the apartments. The citizens bought them with money they had already earned. The psychological effect was profound. A Singaporean who owned their apartment had a stake in the stability of the country. They needed the economy to grow. They needed property values to hold. They needed the government to keep the place clean, safe, and functional, because their life savings were in the walls around them. It was one of the most elegant alignments of individual self-interest with national interest ever devised. Today, over 80% of Singaporeans live in HDB flats, and over 90% of those residents own their homes. Singapore has one of the highest home ownership rates in the world, in a country where the government built every apartment. Education followed the same philosophy. You do not wait for the private sector to build the schools you need. You build them yourself, you make them excellent, and you make attendance compulsory. Literacy in Singapore went from 72% in 1970 to over 97% by the turn of the century. Today, Singapore's students consistently rank first in the world in mathematics and science, beating every country on the planet, including Finland, Japan, and the United States. Lee Kuan Yew served as Prime Minister of Singapore for 31 years, from 1959 to 1990. After stepping down, he remained in the cabinet as senior minister, then as minister mentor, until 2011. He was never truly absent from power until the very end. He died on March 23, 2015, at the age of 91. The eulogies were extraordinary. Barack Obama called him a true giant of history. Tony Blair said he was a unique figure who made an unparalleled contribution. World leaders who had spent decades arguing with him, criticizing his authoritarian tendencies, condemning his restrictions on press freedom and political opposition, all found themselves, at the moment of his death, acknowledging something that was impossible to deny. The numbers were undeniable. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita, $500, the same as Mexico and South Africa. In 1990, when Lee stepped down as Prime Minister, $13,000, surpassing South Korea and Israel. In 2025, over $94,000, higher than the United States of America. In 60 years, Singapore went from third world to first, and then kept going, past every benchmark that was supposed to represent the ceiling. But here is what makes this story more complicated than a simple triumph. Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore was not a liberal democracy. The press was controlled. Opposition politicians were sued into bankruptcy or imprisoned under laws that were technically legal and practically designed to eliminate political competition. Public behavior was regulated in ways that struck Western observers as absurd. Famously, chewing gum was banned. Lee's philosophy was explicit. Individual freedoms had to be subordinated to collective stability until the society was prosperous enough to afford the luxury of dissent. He never fully accepted that the time had come. Critics argued, and continue to argue, that Singapore's success could have been achieved without the authoritarianism, that the same intelligence, the same strategic clarity, the same investment in education and infrastructure could have been deployed in a genuinely free society and produced the same results. Lee believed they were wrong. He believed that the discipline required to build what Singapore built could not have survived the messiness of genuine democratic debate. He may have been right. He may have been wrong. Singapore never tried the experiment both ways, so we will never know for certain. What we know is what actually happened. A man stood in front of television cameras in 1965 and wept for a country he wasn't sure would survive. He spent the next 50 years making sure it would. He made decisions that were visionary, decisions that were brutal, and decisions that historians will debate for generations. And when he died, the country he built was richer per person than the United States of America. Not because of oil, not because of land, not because of any natural advantage that Singapore was given at birth, because of choices, because of discipline, because of a government that decided, in a moment of total crisis, that the only option was to be better at everything than everyone else. When Lee was once asked to explain the secret of Singapore's success, he gave an answer that contained no inspiration and no comfort. He said, "We had no choice but to make it work." In the end, that is perhaps the most important economic lesson Singapore teaches the world. Not the specific policies, not the sovereign wealth funds or the port strategy or the bilingual education system. The lesson is simpler and harder than any of that. When you have nothing to fall back on, you find out what you are actually capable of. Singapore found out.